Okay, hello everyone. We're going to get started in a few minutes. Just waiting for more folks to come in to the webinar. Also, if folks are comfortable while you're coming into the webinar, if you can introduce yourself in the chat should be at the bottom of your screen. You know, your name, where you're from, and maybe a little bit of why you're here or what you hope to learn from the webinar today. Just going to get started in a few minutes. Thank you for waiting for the folks that are already here. Okay, we're going to start in another minute or so. If you are just logging on, if you're comfortable, you can please introduce yourself in the chat, where you're from, and what you hope to learn today. Okay, we're going to get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Famina Zaman. I'm the Cultural Outreach Advocate at Bridges, and we'd like to welcome you to our 4th Lunch Connections webinar. Thank you for joining. Today, we're going to be talking about ACEs. We're going to explore the trauma and the impact of ACEs, which are adverse childhood experiences. So I'd like to introduce you to our 2 panelists today, Tori and Amy Jo. Take it away.
Here we go. I'm so sorry, I was muted. Before we get started, we wanted to take a few minutes and introduce ourselves. Thank you so much for checking in and letting us know who you are and what brought you here today. My name is Amy Jo Muscott, and I am the Education Coordinator at Bridges Domestic and Sexual Violence Support Services in Nashua. I've worked at Bridges for over 6 years and have had the opportunity to provide prevention programming to students, stakeholders, and community members. And I'm here with my awesome colleague, Tori Cronin, who's our ACEs Child Advocate. We'd like to welcome you to our 4th Lunch Connections. Tori?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tori Cronin. As Amy Jo mentioned, I'm the ACEs Child Advocate here at Bridges. My position allows me to research and develop sustainable programs based on adverse childhood experiences for survivors of trauma in our community. And before we begin, I just want to remind you that this will be recorded. Everyone's going to be muted, and Amy Jo and I will only be visible at the end for our discussion and questions. We encourage you to engage with us by adding your thoughts and questions into the chat that's going to be monitored by Famina. She will answer your questions or integrate it into our final conversation later today. The more that we reflect together, the more dynamic our experience will be today. So over the next hour, we're going to have the opportunity to learn about the prevalence of adverse childhood experiences, as well as the physical and emotional impact. In addition, we're going to reflect on our assumptions and how each of us brings our own history into our interactions with others. We will discuss several strategies to address adverse experiences, mental health, and behaviors in children and adults. Amy Jo?
Thank you. So during this presentation, we hope to give you an overview of trauma and provide strategies so that you can support yourself, but also support others. Our objectives include how trauma affects our bodies, brains, and behaviors, key findings of the ACEs study, the impact of ACEs on behaviors and health outcomes, the multigenerational trauma and its challenges for children and adults, and ways that we can promote resilience through relationship building, predictability, and self-regulation strategies. Next slide. Okay. So do you think that ACEs are common in your community or in our community? And what are some of the challenges that members of your community face or have faced? Why don't you take a minute and think about ACEs and place some thoughts in the chat. We'd love to hear from you. Are ACEs common, and what are some of the challenges that people face? Absolutely. So socioeconomic class, racism, a lot about. I know there are children who go to bed hungry, especially in northern New Hampshire. Absolutely. So food insecurity is huge. Abuse, neglect, COVID, right? Which is a whole new layer that we're now dealing with. Common challenges, very, very much. Caretaker substance abuse, neglect. ACEs are common. Domestic violence, sexual abuse, absolutely. All of these are really, really good thoughts and things that we are going to be talking about today. Next slide.
So before we take a more in-depth look at adverse childhood experiences, let's just take a moment and look at stress. So there are 3 types of stress: positive, tolerable, and traumatic or toxic stress. So positive stress is normal, it's essential, and it's a healthy part of our day-to-day lives. An example of this is the first day of school, or getting a shot, or starting a new job, or even giving a presentation. So it's actually promoting growth and positive change in someone's life. Then there's tolerable stress, and this is actually activating our stress system. It can be intense, it can be severe, but it's brief and it's usually not long lasting. An example of this is going to be a loved one, a loss of a loved one, or a broken bone, and our body is likely to recover from this type of stress. And then we reach toxic stress, and this is a strong, frequent, and chronic type of stress. An example of this would be physical or emotional abuse, a caregiver with substance use disorder, or exposure to violence. And children who experience chronic stress are often victims of abuse by their caregivers. So these people are the people that should be trusting and loving and providing protection for these children. So when these children experience this type of abuse, it truly impacts their view of the world. And this stress is extremely prolonged, an activation of the stress response, and it can be damaging to the brain and the body as well. And we're going to continue to explore this throughout the presentation a little bit further. So now we're just going to look at the ACEs study and how the ACEs came to be. So in the mid-90s, the CDC and Kaiser Permanente collaborated on a research study, and they examined how the relationship between chronic stress in children and adult health outcomes are related. So they collected data over 17,000 participants about their history of the exposure to what we know now as the adverse childhood experiences, or the ACEs. So the participants were asked questions which included the topics that are in front of you on your screen. So the abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. And then under those, the 3 main categories, there's more specific categories underneath that gets into more specific things. So this study was the origin of the ACEs 10-question questionnaire, which has also been used to assess the level of stress during childhood. And the questionnaire allows clients to identify the number of affirmative answers rather than what adversities they actually experienced. So for every yes, they got a point on their ACE scores. And it doesn't matter how many times they experienced that adversity, they still just get 1 point on their ACE score. And then these ACE scores were then correlated against their health outcomes. And we'll send more resources your way on the ACE study and the questionnaire as a follow-up to today's presentation. And while this study was mainly focused on the negative health outcomes, more recent research has shows the impact on the children's brain development when exposed to toxic stress. So it actually impacts the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex because there's less gray matter in these areas. And your hippocampus is actually shrinking, which in turn impacts the function, such as decision-making, the fear processing, memory, and stress management as well. So the ACE study discovered these findings, that ACEs are common. There is a dose-response relationship between ACEs and health outcomes. So that means the higher your ACE score, the greater chance for the negative health outcomes. And that can be seen through these statistics. So someone with 4 ACEs is 2 times more likely to have heart disease, 4 times more likely the risk of depression, 7 times more likely to become an alcoholic, and 12 times more likely to attempt suicide compared to someone with 0 ACEs. So these results were staggering, and they are having a huge impact on our outlook on public health.
But there also is a community element or an environmental element to ACEs. So the additional adversities that were not necessarily included in the ACEs study focused on things that did provide adversity for people as they grew up or as they lived. One was violence outside the home, unsafe neighborhoods, homelessness, bullying, discrimination, and income or food insecurity. So just imagine if you're growing up in an environment with gun violence, so that guns are around you in your neighborhood and in your common experience. Your experience in terms of your ability to feel that your environment is safe is going to be very different from someone who does not have gun violence in their neighborhood. And as we continue this exploration, I do want to think a little bit about privilege. So what is privilege? And what does privilege afford us? Take a minute and just put your thoughts in the chat. What does privilege afford us? Absolutely, sense of security, safety, lawyers, being able to afford support and therapy, absolutely, opportunity, absolutely. These are all awesome answers. And I want you to think also about what privilege or marginalization, what these things do to impact resilience and the experience of trauma. Absolutely, really, really some great information there. So more recent research has shown that ACEs are even more common in low-income families and among certain racial and ethnic minority groups in the United States. These inequalities can be correlated back to the World Health Organization, who describes it as social determinants of health. Those are the conditions in which people are born, grow, live, and work and age. And obviously this impacts the distribution of money, power, and resources. In the initial ACEs study that we referenced, most of the participants were white, middle or upper middle class, college educated people living in San Diego. They were all employed and had great health care, and they probably also had privilege. And even though they did not represent the various diversities in America, approximately half of them still experienced at least one ACE. So regardless of their privilege, they still experienced ACEs. I want you to just take a minute and just think to yourself about the kinds of experiences that you've had, that you've experienced. Tori?
So there is an intersection of domestic violence, intimate partner violence, and ACEs. But before we look at that, let's just define what abuse is. So abuse is the systemic pattern of power and control by one partner against another. Our clients at Bridges have been disempowered as children or in their adult relationships, and they have experienced numerous adversities in their lives. So as you can see from our experiences at Bridges, as well as the statistics listed in front of you, there is a greater chance of other ACEs if you have experienced domestic violence or intimate partner violence. And that exposure increases the risk of health and behavior challenges from adolescent into adulthood. So Dr. Burke Harris explains ACEs with her analogy of a bear. So take a moment now and imagine you're in the woods for a walk, and all of a sudden a bear comes out and starts to chase you. Please put into the chat what is happening in your body in that moment that that bear is chasing you.
So absolutely, adrenaline rush, heart racing, freezing, fight, flight, or freeze. Absolutely, all of these things.
Yeah, that's great. So those are all great examples, and that's really illustrating the effectiveness of your survival skills when you're faced with a life or death situation in the forest. But the problem occurs when the bear makes regular appearances in your home or in your community. So in the case of a child, they would always be on the lookout for threats, and their fear and adrenaline is going to be heightened very often. So kids may see additional threats and they may display an escalated response when they've been regularly exposed to violence, neglect, or abuse. So that constant stress turns into toxic stress, and that's what can interfere with rational responses, brain development, behavior, the child's ability to learn, and their future and physical mental health as well. Okay, so you guys all gave great examples when faced with a stressful situation where fight, flight, or freeze response is activated. So, adrenaline and cortisol is pumping through the bloodstream, and we do whatever we need to survive. So an example of this is when we're cooking in our kitchen. We might leave something on the stove. It starts getting a little smoky in our house. The fire alarm goes off. It starts beeping. We open the windows. We wave our pillows at the alarm to get it to stop. The alarm responded as if there was a fire in the home. Our brain can do the same thing. It can fail to distinguish between a real and a perceived threat of danger. So another example is if you're a 5-year-old living in a home with domestic violence and a parent struggling with substance use disorder, you may experience threats every day, and that chronic stress becomes toxic. Children are especially vulnerable to the repeated stress activation because their bodies and their brains are still in a critical time of development. And it is very critical for children, but it can also really impact adults as well. So as you can see, stress and our stress response can be helpful, it can be formative and life-saving, but it can also be intense and chronic, which can impact our physical and mental health when we have these perceived threats.
So what is going on? Let's think about behavior for a minute. What is going on beneath the surface? All behavior, the good and the bad, has meaning, and we might not understand the meaning of the behavior in context. In addition, Dr. Burke Harris, one of the pediatrician who really was impacted by ACEs in her work with her patients, explained that many children with behavior challenges have been misdiagnosed for ADD or ADHD. Trauma, depression, anxiety, ADD, and ADHD can present in similar ways in children, and it can be confusing for practitioners to understand the function or root of a particular behavior. Decoding behavior is a challenging task because, like the iceberg, we only see what's above the surface. To address challenging behavior, we need to find ways to de-escalate the individual who might be in their fight, flight, or freeze response. We need to deactivate the threat, and we also have to present coping strategies. Individuals are processing, healing, and protecting themselves from trauma in a way that we may not understand. Their bodies are doing what they can to cope, and each person has their own way of processing adverse experiences. Have you ever found yourself making judgments about someone and their behavior? And feel free to just think about it, but also feel free to share any thoughts in the chat. Go ahead, Tori. We can continue while people are thinking. So there are many ways that people do cope, and there are healthy coping methods or mechanisms, and there are unhealthy coping methods and mechanisms. Many people who have experienced trauma use avoidance as a coping mechanism to try to forget the trauma that they've experienced. Coping methods like smoking and drinking and substance use are all ways that can help them feel better in the moment by soothing their fear and anxiety and anger or depression, but it does not last forever. Look at this graph. What do you notice? Please put your observations in the chat. What do you notice on this particular chart? Absolutely. So the more ACEs correlate with more substance abuse, right? Drugs and alcohol are the highest. Yep, lots of alcohol and drugs and substance use. Absolutely. The more ACEs, the higher risk of concerning behaviors and high trauma childhood environments. All of these things are great thoughts. So as you can see, ACEs and these type of coping methods are very extreme, and the more ACEs a person experiences, the higher their risk for all of these challenges. We can nurture empathy and connection. We can help people learn healthy coping strategies, which can continue to aid them in healing and growing.
So we're just going to look and see if we can change some of the questions that we're asking. So with empathy, we could ask, what happened to you? To promote healing, we could ask, how can I help you heal? And to be nurturing, we can ask, how can I help you? It's important that we try to look beyond the behaviors and show compassion and try to understand everyone's unique life experience. It's not about what's wrong with them, but it's about what happened to them. We can make a shift in supporting individuals. We can reframe our interactions with clients through a trauma-informed lens, and it can allow us to decode their behavior, offer necessary support, and approach them in a non-blaming, empathetic manner. Those with a history of adversity deserve to know that adversities make their lives more difficult. It's not their fault, and there is hope. It's important to ask these questions through a trauma-informed lens before we initially respond to situations that we might react differently otherwise.
And the other piece that's really important is that traumatic experiences do impact an individual's core belief system in themselves. They may not, if they grew up or live with domestic violence, they may truly believe that they are no longer worthy of care, protection, or love. They may see the world and relationships as no longer benign and trustworthy and safe. Their own worldview may be distorted, and they may not believe in themselves. Parents and children may serve as traumatic reminders of their traumatic experiences. And most of all, parents may believe that they are not capable of keeping their children safe. In addition, because parents were never taught safe boundaries during their childhood, they may struggle to set boundaries and set limits for their children. Parents and children can also experience anxiety and a global sense of loss of control. This often spans throughout many generations, as youth can carry the perceptions of earlier generations. So a mother and her son go to a doctor's appointment for a checkup. A pediatrician asks the mom to privately complete an adverse child experiences or ACEs questionnaire and asks to do one with the son as well. The questionnaire reveals that the son had witnessed his mom being physically abused by her last two boyfriends, and the mom discloses that her father was abusive to her and her mother when she was a child. This is one example of what intergenerational trauma can look like. In your work, have you ever come across families who have similar traumas passed down from generation to generation. Researchers are only beginning to examine the effects of parents' ACEs on their children's health. The potential intergenerational effects of ACEs are supported by research revealing an increased risk of adverse health outcomes or challenges among children of parents who experience chronic trauma themselves. Trauma-related patterns within families can be interrupted in the presence of nurturing, safe, and predictable relationships with a safe environment. Addressing trauma as it occurs in childhood can also help those children develop into more resilient parents themselves and help break this cycle.
So there are risk factors and protective factors. So risk factors could be parental stress or poverty, and protective factors could be social connection or concrete support in times of need. Protective factors nurture resilience. They add positive experience and support to someone's life. It's critical for everyone, regardless of age, sex, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, or socioeconomic status. We all need protective factors, and we can all be protective factors for those in our communities. One of the greatest resources we can share with people who have experienced trauma is to nurture relationships that are safe and stable and predictable. When we have these relationships, we can actually buffer children and their families from the adverse effects of other stressors in their lives. So there's an analogy that I like to use with risk factors and protective factors. So I call it the well-being piggy bank account. So there's a deposit every time a child experiences connection with their caregiver or they're having their needs met, and the pennies are deposited into the bank. But sometimes withdrawals need to be made. So an example of this is when the caregiver is less available and not attending to the children's needs, or a traumatic event might happen. But there's already money in that piggy bank. So there is enough in there to get through it. They can bounce back. So in this analogy, the risk factors are the withdrawal and the protective factors are the pennies. However, sometimes there are not enough pennies or there are no pennies at all in the piggy bank to cover the withdrawals that continue to happen. So there's not enough to cover the deficit. They have an overdrawn well-being bank account, and it's stressful being overdrawn and having a negative bank balance anyways. So they may find that the world is unsafe, and they may respond with certain behaviors that can be labeled as difficult, challenging, or hard to manage. And this is because they don't have any pennies in their bank account, and they don't have those examples of the protective factors to help them. There's more risk factors in their lives. So our job as a community is to make as many deposits into people's well-being piggy bank accounts. And it's important to note that it's not impossible to even out that deficit. It just takes time and support from others.
So we're talking about connection, and Brene Brown talks a lot about the importance of connection. So our next question that we'd like you to think about is, what can you do now? What can you do now to create or maintain connection with the people that you know, that you care about, or that you work with? One of the things that you can do is to look for opportunities to connect with others. Be present. It can be as simple as sharing a smile, doing an activity together, or sitting with a child who's upset. Connection is very impactful for both children and adults. Focus on encouragement. Encouragement allows for people to be their best selves, and it provides support instead of focusing on the accomplishments themselves. Use mistakes as opportunities to learn and reflect and focus on solutions. Reduce stigma and do not judge people faced with or seeking help with their challenges. Always assume goodwill. And then last of all, but really, really important, is that you take care of yourself. Take time for self-care and ask for help when you need it. Balance your needs with the needs of a current situation, And I'd like to share a story that I heard about a year ago from one of my colleagues. She was walking on Main Street in Nashua, and as she was walking, a young woman was walking towards her who appeared to be homeless. And she looked at the woman and said, "Hello, how are you doing? I hope that you have a really wonderful day." And the woman looked up at her and she made eye contact and she smiled and her eyes welled up with tears. And she said, "Thank you so much for acknowledging me. I feel seen. I feel heard. I feel valued. I'm never acknowledged." So think about how that one act of kindness, how that one connection impacted that person's life. So let's talk for a minute about resilience, because resilience takes on many different forms, but there are lots of different skills that make resilience important for all of us. Resilient individuals can solve problems. They have the tools to build healthy relationships. They can actively listen and attend to people. But most important, or as important, is that they can model healthy interactions for the adults and the children in their lives. And what's also really important to think about is self-regulation. We know that many children that are in our schools struggle with self-regulation. And self-regulation is the ability to manage thoughts and feelings and impulses. Most of all, it can be learned at any age, and children and adults can benefit from learning very, very concrete strategies. At Bridges, we teach our clients concrete skills to be able to help them manage their feelings and find safe outlets for expressing their feelings. Do you have any self-regulation strategies that you already use and that work for you? Take a minute and share them in the chat. Any self-regulation strategies that help you? Meditation, awesome. Exercise, humor, pausing. Yep, we're going to talk about that in a minute, Michelle. Anything else you can think about? Yep. Something with my hands, breathing, daily habits. Again, that routine and predictability. Breathing, box breathing. All of these are awesome strategies. Awesome, awesome strategies. So let's see, we listed a few that we thought might be helpful to share. So the first thing that that I just want to share with you, and we're going to be sending detailed information on many of these techniques, but the first is grounding strategies, which are really important to assist from detaching from emotional pain and feelings and thoughts that might be flooding you. It's important to turn your attention back to the present. And one way of doing this is to notice 5 things you see, 4 things you touch, 3 things you hear, 2 things you smell, and 1 thing you taste. Another really helpful exercise is to stop, take a breath, observe, pull back, and practice your words. The acronym is STOP on there, okay? And then another strategy, which actually I share with preschoolers all the way up to adults, is something called the remote control. When you take your hand and you press that thumb into your fist to remind yourself to stop and think before you react. So to give yourself time to respond rather than react. Many of our clients create coping kits, which are filled with items that assist them in a sensory experience or something that reminds them of a calm and happy place or calm and happy time. Meditation and mindfulness is something that also can be really helpful. And there are many apps that you can now get to get yourself started. But we will be following up with a list and some more strategies that we hope can be helpful. So I also want you to think about self-regulation and self-care, because it is really important as a skill for adults and for children. Children can learn to interact in a healthy way with others. They can learn to manage their emotions and to regulate their emotions so that they can respond to situations rather than to react. And they can also learn to communicate their feelings, their needs, and ways to ask for help in an appropriate way.
So, what are your takeaways from today? Can you share something that you learned in the chat? Well, I can't see the chat, so I hope people are putting some of their ideas into the chat.
Yeah, Tori, they are. They actually are adding some wonderful ones. I'm sorry that I didn't respond. That's okay, but a lot of things that were mentioned were that kids are resilient, the importance of engaging with others and asking for help, routines, the remote control, ways to cope and help others cope with their ACEs and experiences. So there's a lot of really, really good information. And also the fact that ACEs impact everyone generation to generation. So go ahead, Tori.
Wonderful. Well, it sounds like everyone was able to take something away from today. So in addition, we just have some other things that we just want to make sure that you take with you today. So adults and trusting relationships can buffer traumatic experiences. Trauma affects our bodies, brains, and behaviors. ACEs impacts behavior and health outcomes. Multi-generational trauma can present challenges to children and adults. And resilience can be nurtured through relationship building, predictability, and self-regulation skills and strategies.
So before we leave you and before we have our time together to debrief a bit, we'd like to tell you a little bit about Bridges and our services. So the first thing that's really important to know is that all of our services are free and confidential. The only time that we will break confidentiality is when we hear that someone under the age of 18 or a vulnerable adult is being abused. As you know, all of us are mandatory reporters, mandated reporters. Our support line is available 24/7. If someone calls the support line, an advocate will get back to them within 10 minutes, even at 4 in the morning. But what's really important is that you don't need to be in crisis to call. If you just need to call because you want to talk something out or you want emotional support, you always can call Bridges. Walk-in services are available 8:30 to 4:30, Monday through Friday at both offices. And people can come to Bridges without an appointment for many types of support, but due to COVID-19 protocols, we are a bit more limited in the number of clients we can accommodate at any one time. So if you can, we do suggest that you try to call ahead. Advocates help with all different kinds of things, including at the hospital, with court, at the police department, at the Child Advocacy Center, and at DCYF. But what's really, really important to know is that we are here to support people who are struggling in any type of relationship. And you can always call us, and we hope to provide emotional support and resources in the community. In addition, just so you know, we do outreach and we do educational programs that are also free and confidential. So we can help you if you're an educator or if you're at an agency with any kind of educational and prevention programming. In addition, I just want you to be aware of the New Hampshire Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence, which is the umbrella organization, and Bridges is one of their 13 crisis centers throughout the state. Our catchment area covers 14 communities from Salem and Pelham to Wilton and Lyndeborough. We will be including a catchment map, resources, a certificate of completion, and a survey within the next week. And Michelle, we are going to be posting again where the offices are. So thank you for your question. And if there are any other questions, we'd love to know what they are so we can start our conversation.
If anyone wants to ask a question or has a comment, definitely feel free to add it in the chat and we will discuss it. There's one question earlier. I think it might have been answered a little bit, but we could discuss it. Maria had a question earlier asking, have they done a study on the impact of the frequency of an adverse experience? I know that we had that graph on the different adverse experiences and kind of the frequency, but I don't know, maybe this is a question for Tori. Do you know any studies that they have done?
Yeah, I think there's definitely some more research that has been going on about the toxic and traumatic stress, because the toxic stress, it does discuss a lot about the frequency of it because it's chronic and it happens a lot. So I think people are looking into it more now, and the frequencies, because the ACE study doesn't cover that. It only looks at the experiences themselves. And if you have experienced them, I would have to look and see if there was something that there was a study recently about the frequency. But that is a great question. I'm not sure if Amy Jo knows of anything or not, but
I don't offhand, Tori, but you know what I'm thinking is that I think that any time there are repeated experiences, that it is cumulative. I mean, I think that that's something that's really important, you know, to really think about. So I'm sure that even if there is not research, that if someone experiences the same trauma over and over again, that would be definitely impact them.
yes. And just like we talked about earlier, you know, when we do talk about every time that the adversity would happen, you know, that stress response is really triggered, and there is damages that can occur to the brain for children specifically, and it can be, you know, impactful for adults as well.
And Carlotta, thank you so much for having lunch with us, and I'm glad that you learned something. Are there any other questions for Mina? Anything that you're thinking about, or Tori?
No, not that I can think of, but like we said, we will definitely be sending out a follow-up email with more resources and our contact information. So, you know, sometimes after you digest the information and you come up with questions, Amy Jo and I would be happy to connect with you and be able to answer any questions that, you know, maybe you couldn't think of on the spot and come up with afterwards.
Absolutely, and we also will be including our specific contact information. In fact, for Mina, I can do it, but you can do it as well. Can you just put our email in there so that people have that as well? Thank you so much. And so all the information we will be sending out so that you will be getting a great resource packet along with additional resources. There are also some links that we'll be sending out to short videos that will also be helpful. We just didn't want to take our time with that, but we will be sharing the resources with you.
We'll add the emails right now. I was thinking about something. I guess it kind of relates to my position at Bridges. I'd be curious to know, and I'm sure they've done this after the initial ACE study. I know that Amy, Jo, and Tori, you kind of mentioned that a lot of different factors such as like race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity, those kind of things weren't really put into account in the first ACEs study. And most of the folks that took the study were, you know, middle or upper middle class white people. So that the privilege, like you talked about, Amy, Jo, that came kind of through with the folks that participated in the first study. So I would be really curious to see if there are any studies that happened after that kind of added those other elements of, you know, trauma or discrimination, and see how that impact. Obviously, we talked about the fact that it does impact those folks more, but I would love to see some studies. That would be really interesting.
Yeah, and I think that that's a really good point. And I don't know of specific studies, but I do know that there are resources that we can send out. In the meantime, I did want to respond to Michelle's question. It says, are we open physically through COVID? And we did kind of mention it, but basically, we used to be in a situation where we took people in walk-in only, and it was never an issue. But since COVID, we are more limited right now in terms of the number of people that can be in our office. So we can have 2 clients in the office at one time. If you come and there is only 1 client or no clients and there's room for you, we are more than happy to have you come in on a walk-in basis. But if somebody comes in and we already have 2 clients in the office, we'll have to reschedule a different time for them to sit with an advocate. So it is a little bit different right now. We will be moving our offices in October. And at that time, we hope that with the larger space, we'll be able to accommodate more clients and serve them. So I hope that answers your question, Michelle.
Great.
And Femina, sorry, not to go back to it, but Femina, just to talk about, you know, your question that you were just discussing, you know, I don't know the names of the specific studies, but there has been a lot more research talking about a lot more types of adversities than just the 10 that were listed that we saw today that are covered in the ACEs study specifically. And, you know, they are looking at, you know, discrimination and neighborhood violence and more things that, you know, poverty and homelessness and things like that. So those are definitely, there has been quite a bit more research that has been happening lately. I'm not sure of any profound studies that have been as, you know, popular as the ACE study that has come about, but they are continuing to research those things in a lot of different areas, different states even.
Yep. And I think that also, and we'll be sending these resources out as well, but Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, who actually now is a Surgeon General in California, who's a pediatrician that really hopped on board when she learned about ACEs and the population that she worked with in California, talks a lot about her neighborhood that she works in, which a neighborhood that was more impoverished versus the neighborhood that was, quote unquote, across the tracks. And she has a wonderful book called The Deepest Well. That's definitely a great read. There's a lot of great TED Talks that she's done. And she is actually showcased in the film Resilience, which talks about the impact of ACEs.
Yes, she's a brilliant speaker, and I definitely also recommend watching her TED Talks. And I know when we send out the resources, we're going to send out information about her for sure. She is like the pioneer of ACEs for sure. Any other questions or comments? Thank you all for participating in the chat and being, you know, chatty and talkative and answering all our questions and just being here today for the lunch hour.
Yep, and before we go, we do want to mention, if you just turn to the next slide, Tori, that we will be having another Lunch Connections in October. We will be talking about domestic violence because it is Domestic Violence Awareness Month in October. So please join us again. We will definitely keep you informed of our programming that's coming up. And if there's ever anything that you need in terms of support for clients or support for yourself or information or prevention programming, please remember to reach out to us.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so, so much.
Thank you all. And we will be sending out some information, and feel free to email us. Oh, I can add my email as well. But thank you so much for participating. Thank you, Amy, Joe, and Tori, for your wonderful speaking skills and leadership skills.
Thank
and
you,
we will
Amina.
see you, of course, we'll see you all in October, and we look forward to it.
Bye-bye now.
Well.